All right. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Nola Simon. I'm your host of the Hybrid Remote Center of Excellence. And joining me today is Sarah Noll Wilson. She's an executive leadership coach. She's a podcaster. She's a keynote speaker. And I've also done her podcast. So she has a podcast called Conversations on Conversations. And I can never resist a conversation. So I invited her to come here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to return the favor.
Yeah,
I mean, really, I
reciprocation
just
is
want to,
my favorite part of podcasting.
yeah, I just want to be in conversation and talk about important stuff.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And I like talking about the stuff that people aren't brave enough to talk about. So
Mm,
I
mhm.
think that there is stuff that's going on with leadership that we need to discuss. And do you want to lead that off with an
Sure,
example of something that you've come across recently?
I can. As somebody who's had the privilege of working now with, I mean, I probably can say safely thousands of people in positions of power and authority. Um, there's some real traps folks fall into that sometimes can be exhausting as an outsider, but the thing that I was sharing with you, Nola, beforehand, and is is we need to have more conversations about retaliation in the workplace and how common they are and how sometimes they're really obvious and sometimes they aren't. And if you are somebody who has positional authority, you have to understand that there are things you're doing or not doing that could legitimately be a form of retaliation that you're not thinking of as such. And just this week, um, heard stories from a handful of people that I know, or stories about other people through people I know. And it's unfortunately really, really common, I think, in a way that people don't realize how common retaliation happens in the workplace.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I personally have experienced that. And it could be many different aspects of it too. It could be that you're got a policy in place that you don't necessarily agree with that you are required as a leader to enforce, but you don't agree with that. And so you're acting out from
Mm,
that perspective, right?
mm,
It could be that you have a challenging relationship with that individual person.
mhm. And yeah, I mean, let's be real. I mean, I hear you when you say, like, oh, you
Yeah.
might have a policy. Most retaliation, when I see it, is happening because someone's ego's been pushed, right?
Mm,
They've been put on the defense. They've been put on their ego has been pushed a bit. They've been given feedback about how they're showing up or maybe how people are experiencing their team. And, and that act of retaliation often is coming from a place of protection, right? Like, I'm going to put you in your place because I'm feeling lack of power. I'm feeling whatever the case is. And but I think what's important is for us to talk about, like, it's really, sometimes it's really obvious. And like you and I were talking before we hopped on, that sometimes people be like, well, no, people can't retaliate. It's illegal to retaliate. And it's like, yeah, but that shit happens all the time.
yeah.
It just happens all the time.
Yeah. Exactly. And then they play dumb
Hmm.
and say, that's not what happened, or that's not what it was intended. I
Hmm.
think you're reading into it. And then it
Hmm.
becomes this corporate gaslighting.
Hmm. I'm so glad that you used that term, right? That's exactly what happens. And sometimes they're like gaslighting themselves and gaslighting other people instead of being courageous enough to go, huh, you know what? Yeah, I was really upset when they disagreed with me publicly in front of my boss, and that frustrated me. And so I did do this. Like, I mean, the thing is, most people aren't going to have that kind of reflection. But it's so important. It's so important that, again, if you have positional power and authority, that you are working really hard to regulate your emotions. Um, and making sure that you're showing up in a way that is actually aligned with the impact you want to make, and not just like this auto response, auto reaction, protection, right? Like like shadow intention, whatever you want to call it, that gets in your way.
Yeah. And that's actually where the the support that managers have in the workplace can really be important because often you don't necessarily have a network of peers that you feel comfortable with talking about the challenges that you've got,
Mm,
right?
mhm,
So you
mhm.
can't necessarily talk to the people that you work with who report to you because there's a hierarchy, there's a barrier between you. A lot of the work that you do might be confidential. You can't
Yeah.
necessarily tell anybody about an interaction you have with one particular person, right? So who do you talk to
Mm,
when there's nobody that you can talk to? And that's where I
mm.
feel that actually coaching can actually be really
Yep.
helpful
Yeah.
because you get that outside perspective. Even if the coach actually is hired by the organization, they're outside of the team, right? They
Mhm.
don't necessarily have that hierarchy relationship, right? So it could be internal, it could be
Yeah.
external, but they've got distance from the interaction,
Mhm.
right?
And it's a place, it's, I think anyone who's in, especially like a senior leadership position, should have a coach or a therapist, right? Just so that they can have that space because and maybe both, right? A lot
Yes.
a lot of people I work with, I'm always like, I think it's good for you to have both. And to have a place where you can be messy and also have a place where you can be mad
Yeah.
because it's normal, it's healthy to be mad at situations, to feel frustrated with situations, but sometimes we need to just let off a little bit of steam so we're not taking action in a way that's acting upon that anger. And I mean something that I often say is, right, leadership is lonely. It's
Yes.
lonely, and one of the ways we can mitigate to make sure that we're, right, showing up how we want to, making the impact that we want to, is having that safe space where we can be. I mean, I was just talking with a client recently, and I said, "It's okay, like, this is where you get to be messy, right? I'll help you navigate if it feels like we're getting stuck in the mess, but, like, sometimes it's just like, let's get out what you need to get out so then we can process and go, okay, so now how do you want to show up in this situation? Now what's the steps you want to take? Now, right, like what does it look like to show up in this moment that's really anchored to your values and how you want to show up? And it's just so necessary because otherwise we ruminate, or worse yet, we do talk to people that we shouldn't be talking about, and then that's decreasing psychological safety or creating a toxic work environment, or insert whatever potential outcome, when we don't have that space to just process our own emotions.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And I actually did a podcast with a woman who's both a therapist and a coach, and she actually said
Mm,
that that's her dream job is to
mm,
actually work with an organization who hires a coach specifically for that. And every single person in the company gets therapy and coaching.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah, exactly. Now, finding a company that's willing to do that is a challenge, but I can't think of a situation that wouldn't be improved by having a safe space where people
Yeah,
feel comfortable and
yeah.
they trust the confidentiality of it.
Right, right, right. Well, and I think that, when we talk about retaliation, there's probably people who are listening who are thinking to themselves, well, I wouldn't ever, right? Maybe some like self-righteousness and and it's important that, again, a lot of times those moments of retaliation happen when we're emotionally triggered, when we're really stressed, when we're not able to get curious about the situation, have some self-awareness, social awareness, right? Emotional regulation. And that the one point that I would like to bring up is that retaliation can be really, really subtle. It can be really subtle. It can be, and the situations that have been coming across my plate, if you will, have been really severe. I made a complaint, I got fired, right? Like it's a really obvious connection to an extreme level of retaliation. But retaliation can also be, let's say, Nola, you give me feedback that I don't like, and we're in a meeting that afternoon, and I'm looking at you, I'm smiling at you, but I'm
Just my
uh
dog.
Yeah, he's given us some feedback. No, but like being, how many, for people to think at home, like home, how many times have you been in a meeting, you've been really frustrated with someone and you're like, I'm not going to listen to what you're saying. I think
Yep.
I think you're an idiot. I think that's a form of retaliation, right? Not bringing people's names into the room,
Yes, I was
right?
just
When
gonna
it's
say,
Mhm,
especially in a chat, function, like you're online, right? And you're at home, they're in the office,
mm,
it's really easy to retaliate against somebody in a hybrid environment if they're not in the room.
yeah. That's such a great point. And I'm curious to hear more of maybe what you've observed or experienced or watch outs from a standpoint of that because we know the proximity bias is real.
Yes.
That's one of the challenges that we have to overcome in a hybrid work environment. And then it can become even more accelerated if I'm also now intentionally not like, I'm not going to recommend this person for a promotion, or I'm not going to say, you know who we should bring into this project? We should bring in this person, right? Those are all, if I'm doing that from a place of how I describe it, or how I for myself make meaning of it, is if I or whoever the other person is feels powerless and is doing something to have power over the other person,
Mhm.
having control over it, to me, that's usually when the retaliation happens. Um, or the criticism or the judgment or the, insert whatever here. Um, and it is interesting to think about how it looks different and could be even sneakier in a hybrid environment.
Oh, yeah, definitely, and, I mean, it could also be retaliation in a way that you don't even suspect, you don't even realize is happening, and the people who are best at retaliation, I worked with several people who are really expert at it, is using policy.
Mm,
Policy as a battleground, basically.
mm,
And so we used to actually have a policy where if you applied for another job internally, the manager had to be notified,
mm,
right?
mhm,
And give permission, basically. And so that would often happen in the background. So if you didn't tell your manager, they would go through HR and inform them too, and they could actually block you.
mm,
So
mhm.
working
Feels
within
very familiar.
policy. Yeah, and actually it comes up in rewards and recognitions too, and a lot of people don't necessarily understand that either is, we actually had a whole system of rewards and recognition where people could recognize each other. You would get, awards, you could gather points and then exchange them in for, gift certificates or books or whatever you wanted to do. But when it actually came to a certain dollar value, in the background, there was a policy that if you're it would actually go to the manager, and if you were in any risk or they wanted to put you up for performance improvement or anything like that, the manager actually had veto power about whether you
Mm,
actually get that reward or recognition. So that's where policy
yeah.
and a sequence of policies can
Mm,
actually be used in a method that's retaliatory.
sure. Yeah.
And that is where you find microaggressions.
Yeah.
These are where the these are the things in the shadows of organizations that people don't necessarily realize are operating,
Mhm.
and that's how retaliation can be really hard to prove.
Yeah. It's well, and those examples are such good ones from the standpoint of, from the standpoint of, yeah, I'll be flexible with you on this one because I really like you. You're part of my in group. So I'm gonna, right? Like I'm gonna fudge the policy, or I'm gonna bend it, or be more flexible with you. But with you, I'm gonna hold it really, really firm, really tight. Like this
Yep.
is what needs to happen. And I think that's the thing that's been really interesting for us to explore, is that the subtleties of it. And or and sometimes it is unintentional, like, but it's not. And when I say that, so I want to think about backing this up with a story, right? Like, that you think you've taken care of a problem in a way that feels like a good solution, when really it's not. So it might not be coming from that place of protection, but so like, I don't know, here's an example. You have somebody who's struggling to work with someone. And so you move them to another team. Like, we're just going to move them to another team because that's going to solve it. Um, but unintentionally can create issues, right? For the person who is having issues, right? And suddenly they're not being collaborative, or they still have to work with this person, or they still, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm trying to be a little careful in the example that I share, because I'm thinking of something very, very specific in my head.
Yeah.
But
No, I've seen that happen as well too. You
yeah,
think that it's a solution because you're separating personalities that,
yeah,
but the thing is, it's all built within a network. And
yeah,
any
right.
organization is a network. So it may appear separate, but there's relationships that happen around those
Yeah.
people, and everybody knows a piece of the story.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
it's sort of also like a game of telephone. We were talking also about how gossip can be
Mm.
both positive and negative. In that situation, it could be both, right?
Hmm.
So that's where it can be damaging. And this is where psychological safety gets impacted by actions like this. I actually have a story I can share. So
Yeah.
I worked with a gentleman, and you probably could relate to this as well too, because he was a person who had chosen not to have children. And I know we've talked before that,
Mm. Hmm.
you and your husband are not ever going to do that, right?
Nope.
So you might be able to relate to his perspective. He was really frustrated because we were on a team where there was backup responsibilities, right? And so my daughters had this whole run of lice for 7 weeks. My school kept sending my kids home, and I would kept having to leave because I had no backup daycare, right? And like I lived 2 hours away, and I was the solution, right? I ended
Yeah.
up having to
Yeah.
take a week off, and then I took a whole week off, and then it continued and continued and continued. And I actually had to go after the school board and have the whole policy for the whole board changed in order to get them to
Mm.
stop.
Mm.
That's a whole different story. But in conjunction with that, somebody else on my team, her brother actually died, but he died in the Philippines, and he had
Mm.
3 children. So she actually had to go out to the Philippines to take care of his family, and she ended up bringing his nieces and nephews back to Canada. And long story short, she was gone for 6 to 8 weeks. So
Mm.
that all happened concurrently. And so in terms of workload, the team was really impacted because they kept having to
Sure.
step up. But he was really frustrated because he just associated everything to do with children. Like he had a
Mm.
real bias about
Mm.
it,
Hmm.
right? Um, and the solution that they came up with was to promote him. And
So he could take care of the challenges, or what was the?
no, so he could actually be within a team where he didn't actually have that backup responsibility,
Got
right?
it.
So they could
Yeah.
see his and understand his frustration, but they also knew that he was actually contributing negatively to the situation because of his own personal attitude towards parents, right?
Sure. Sure.
Um, uh, so anyways, they moved him to an area where he really was like an individual contributor and didn't have that interdependency in
Sure.
that team. And so from a perspective that way, it was a better fit for him and all that stuff. But the problem that I had that with that, it wasn't that I wasn't empathetic about the workload and all of that stuff. I can understand that, but nobody else was given that opportunity to apply for
Yeah.
that job.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So it
Yeah.
caused
Yeah.
some resentment because it's like he's coming to a place from a place that's actually really negative, and it's a workload issue. It's a company policy issue. That job and those tasks and those responsibilities have all been defined by the company, and you wouldn't redefine them. You wouldn't renegotiate them. You wouldn't work with that
Mm.
at all. Your
Hmm.
solution was to take that person out
Yeah.
and promote him and give him a raise for behaviors that weren't really fueling the business,
Mm. Hmm.
right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's where it's like it felt like we were actually being retaliated
Yeah. Sure. Sure.
because we had children and we had other demands that are outside of the work,
Yeah.
right? And it
Yeah.
felt negative to us, and it felt like a punishment to us.
Mm,
right?
mhm,
And
mhm.
we still had to work with him because the position that they moved him into was more about like fund reporting and whatnot. So when there was like any kind of escalation, and whatnot, we needed detailed information. He was it.
Yeah, sure.
So we still had to talk with him,
Mhm.
right? So that's an example of
It
how.
no, I mean, I think it's a good example. I mean, and, I mean, uh, like, there's layers to it, right?
Oh
There's
yeah,
layers because it's like, there's a lot of companies that the first people they brought back into the office were the people who didn't have kids.
yeah,
Right?
and that's
Like, and
not fair.
that's right, and that's a layer to it, but, I mean, it is a good example of the unintended like, an unintended form of punishment, an unintended form of, right, retaliation or limiting, and I get it, like, some situations are complex, like and how do we make sure, again, if we have the power and authority, right, how do we make sure we're thinking about it all d through the lens of multiple perspectives, right? When you think
Yeah.
about building a high psychologically safe culture, one of the most important skills is perspective taking. And
Yes.
right? And how do we make sure we consider other people's perspectives when we're making decisions? And that doesn't often happen. It's
Right. And
yeah.
that's where it's like, Sarah, if you don't happen to know, has a book called Don't Feed the Elephants. And so she has beautiful creative names about all kinds of different things. So what were we avoiding in that situation? The avoid
Mhm.
offense. We
Yeah,
were
yep,
avoiding
yeah.
looking at how the job was designed, how the work was contributing to the issue, what the
Yeah,
assumptions
potentially
were.
having the conversation with him about how he was talking about it or his criticisms of it,
Yeah.
potentially.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And his reactions to it. So it's he was feeling that he was absorbing too much of the work because he didn't have children, and
yeah.
that's not fair either. I get
Yep, yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. Yep,
But
multiple
the
truths.
question really is, how do you get the work done in a way that feels fair to all parties involved,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's really what you have to solve for, and they didn't solve that
No.
because that continued to play out in multiple different areas in multiple different ways, just with different people involved, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Because they didn't solve the core issue, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
that's where it's really helpful to look at things and take that perspective, like you said, right? And
Mhm.
question your assumptions. uh, Look at what you're avoiding and work towards something that's going to be future focused so that you can come up with better solutions in the future and make it a better environment for everybody involved.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the practices, that could be a lesson learned in this situation that you shared is really listening to, are we making decisions to ease discomfort? Like to remove our discomfort, to remove someone else's. It's just easier if we just do this, right? Are we making this decision because I'm, again, in being really honest with ourselves, am I feeling prickly? This might not be the time to make a decision about this person or this situation.
Yep.
Um, and to slow down a bit. And again, that takes an incredible amount of self-awareness and some courage with yourself, but the best leaders that I see are the ones who are able to catch those moments of, I shouldn't send this email. This is
Yeah,
not the time
exactly.
for me
That's
to
right.
like to do what I'm doing. Or I think we are avoiding something. Like I think we're avoiding having this conversation, and let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Um, and it's like common sense, but not common practice.
Yeah, and well, it takes courage, right? And
Hmm.
it's all working within a system too. So you might feel comfortable in your immediate team, but if you're working with a situation that's going to get escalated, that's going to go up the hierarchy, and all of a sudden you're dealing with VPs and senior VPs and executive VPs, and then goes to CEO. Are you feeling safe at all of those different levels? And quite often the answer is going to be no.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because then it becomes fear-based. What am I risking,
Hmm.
right? And, um, somebody's gonna back down somewhere and avoid
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
risk, right?
Hmm. Yeah, which is like such a good reminder. for people who are in some of the top positions, is to just realize that power dynamic, right? That just because you're comfortable, just because you feel safe, just because it's easy for you, recognize that part of the reason that it's likely that part of the reason why you feel like you could have those conversations is because you have the like kind of ultimate authority in the situation, and to realize that your title, your position, absolutely impacts people's comfort with, do I feel safe to talk with this person or not? Do I feel safe to disagree? Do I feel safe to bring up this concern? And what's really unfortunate is that when I think about when I think about the situations where people have made formal complaints about a toxic workplace, it's almost not surprising then that they were retaliated against, right? Like the very thing that they're speaking up against is just being perpetuated in how it's responding to. And the reason I say that is, like, obviously, if we had a good culture, if we had a safe culture, I'm not making any complaints. I'm not making anything, right? So it's like an unfortunate, just like consistent pattern of, and people are like, should I say something? And it's like, you gotta weigh it. You gotta weigh
Yep.
if it's worth the risk. Is it worth what would likely happen? Is it worth, and I can't tell you that. But if the culture is such that you feel the need, even if it's within a single relationship, right? Even if it's just me and a coworker and I feel like they are being aggressive or abusive or harmful to me, something about the culture has tolerated that,
Hmm.
which means you bringing it up, right? Like, is likely going to be met with probably not the most like thoughtful response. I'm speculating or I'm like just
Nope.
talking out loud a bit, but it is like, well, so no wonder
Yeah.
this is so common when people are speaking up and saying, hey, time out, this isn't right.
Yeah.
Like somewhere in the culture has tolerated that behavior.
Yeah. I had an instance where I actually went to HR and filed a formal complaint.
Mm,
I had a manager who screamed at me.
mm,
20 years in my career, I'd never had a manager actually ever scream at me. And I had a US senator fired from his day job. I dealt
mm,
with a lot of unpleasant people, and but nobody who was actually like my direct reporting relationship. And so the way that they came back to me was, happy to talk to you about it. You need to talk to this HR mediator or whatever they called him. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to do that because I already know that I'm not set up to succeed here.
yeah, yeah,
But I documented it, and really that's actually what I wanted to start was, if I have another issue, I already had a documentation,
yeah.
right?
That's that's such a good point, because there might be people listening who are experiencing this, and they're, and again, sometimes we can gaslight ourselves of, is that really happening? Did that really just, like, that wasn't okay, right? Like that wasn't okay, that and how, yeah, I mean a couple of things. So if people are thinking about or questioning, like, am I experiencing retaliation? One is document everything, because what I've seen in multiple times, and there was a situation recently where, somebody was making observations of some sketchy finances and went into full, like, we're going to shut off your access, we're going to terminate this agreement. And it was such a clear line for me, and I'm like, you need to document everything, because even if you decide not to come back, even if you decide not to pursue something, you cannot trust that they might not try to do something and pursue something, so it's a bit
Yeah.
of like, what layers of protection? Also, talking to other people um who've maybe either gone through it or professionals to remind you and say, yep, nope, what you are experiencing is retaliation, or what you experienced was harassment. And, because let's be honest, mm, I don't know the stats yet. We're doing some research on it. But all of the stories I have of retaliation involve either women and then connected people of color, right? So
Yeah.
it's largely, right, marginalized groups who are experiencing it. And what can happen is for, when I think about times when I've experienced retaliation, it can put me into a fawn response. That's like a default response for me, is like um people pleasing, or like, what did I do, or kind of beating myself up of like, man, could I have handled that differently? Could I have done this differently? I mean, I had a situation, and I haven't really talked about it that much, but I had a situation with a client, a potential client. Let me rephrase it. Potential client. And their communication started to become more condescending. More, we hadn't even contracted, but condescending, uh, um, threatening. Like, if you want this job, you will do X, Y, and Z, right? And
Mm.
it was like, whoa, this. I mean, folks, we're talking about leadership development. We're not. I mean, like, there's nothing. you know, you know, like, what? Why are we having this reaction? So, long story short, every single person on the team started to get really bad vibes of like,
Mm.
I don't think this is the right partner for us. We're having to navigate some like what seems like unnecessary emotions to what should be just normal communications, right? We are a group of women. This is, like, he's a male, and there's that dynamic at play. And so we withdrew from consideration. And I remember telling my colleagues and my husband, and I said, I'm just going to say it. This isn't going to go well for us. Like, it will be the right thing, but this probably won't go well, because my experience is, and I'm just going to be really honest, my experience is when I'm dealing with a man who's overconfident, being told no by a woman doesn't usually elicit a civil response. I've had enough experiences, I've had enough observations, I have enough stories from friends. And what happened was, after we withdrew, I received a half a dozen just harassing emails. Like, no, no, hey, whoa, can we slow down? Can we have a conversation about this? What happened? Why are we, right? Like, I thought we were fine. It was, you're the most immoral person I've ever met. You are the most, right? Like, it was very personal attacks, and it just validated everything that we were feeling.
You got to
And right,
admire him for putting it in writing.
I mean,
That's awful, and I'm
it
sorry. Yeah.
no, I appreciate that. And when I tell people it was unhinged, when I sent a
Yeah.
message saying, your reaction to this validated my like my worst
Yeah.
worries about what it would be like to work with you. The response he sent was, I need you just to forget I even exist. And like, now I'm not laughing about it because I think it's funny. I don't think it's funny.
No, it's not.
It was terrible. It was absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
And in that moment, I went into a full fawn response, right? I went into like a fawn freeze, like flight response of like vacillating from rage to like, God, could I have done something different? Did I miss something? Was I okay? Am I overreacting? Because, like, again, when you're not part of the dominant culture, it's really easy to question your thinking, and one of the things that was really helpful to me in that moment was having other people remind me really explicitly what happened. And then me reminding myself, nope, he used threatening language. He was personally attacking. He was, right. Like, this was a full retaliation, because we withdrew. And, somebody who's near and dear to me, who's unfortunately going through it, I was like, I need you to remember what they're doing is retaliation.
Yeah.
Like, you did everything right. You, from the standpoint of bringing up a concern, right? Like, questioning some decisions that were at best unethical, at worst potentially illegal, right? Like, you did your due diligence. So, like, when you get into your head about, oh, should I have handled it differently? Did I miss something? Am I overreacting? Right? Which I think can be a really normal place to go into. Just remind yourself, they are retaliating because you, like, brought up a truth that they didn't want people to know about.
Yeah.
And
Exactly. Like their balance, their story of themselves is being challenged,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
And
And
that's
that
really
reaction isn't about you. It's about them. Like, it sucks that you have to experience it. It totally
yep.
sucks. And how do we make sure that we don't, if we're on the receiving end of it, that we do what we need to do to make sure it doesn't erode who we are, that it doesn't erode our sense of self, that it doesn't erode, right, like how we show up going forward. Um, and I mean, that could be a whole nother conversation sometime. It's just like, if, I'm actually really glad that we wove into this, because I think that there likely are people who are listening who are like, I'm in that situation right now. What do I do?
Yep. And it can be
Document.
really delicate situations. There's another example that I have as well. Somebody that I work with, they were both married, they were having an affair.
Mm,
She was a manager, and the way that the
mm,
team operated, we had 3 different managers. They all made independent decisions on their team, except when it came to bonus and compensation.
mm,
And then it would become a joint discussion.
sure,
So I debated, I mean, I found out by accident because I clicked on the wrong email because we had shared
sure.
inboxes. It was eye-opening.
Hmm.
But I debated whether I ever reported that to the ethics board
Yeah.
because it was about the compensation for me. I was like, how do I trust that you're making decisions that have integrity when
Hmm.
I know that you're compromised,
Mm, hmm.
right?
Hmm.
But I never did,
Mm,
in part because he had children. I
mm.
mean, his decisions are his decisions,
Yeah.
whatever. I didn't admire what they were doing. But it's like his mother was an executive assistant to the CEO.
Mm.
What's the risk?
Those ethical dilemmas.
Those
It's
ethical
the,
dilemmas. And
yeah.
when his father died, they shut the call center down so people could attend the funeral.
Mm,
Do you think they were really going to take action?
mm, mhm,
Because I complained?
mhm.
I perceived that as too great a risk.
Yeah, yeah. And no one would fault you for that. I think that's the thing, is for people to assess. I mean, that's even something, if we talk about that even on a, lower risk level of having certain conversations, like I always tell people there are times when we should consciously avoid. The risk is too high.
Yep.
Maybe the relationship isn't worth it.
No.
But how do we make sure that if we're choosing not to, that it's not coming from a place of feeling powerless, but recognizing I'm going to choose to protect myself in this situation. I'm
Right.
going, like from a place of power within, of like, whether that's, um I've assessed it, it's, I don't have other job opportunities right now, or right, like, or whatever the case is, and here's what I'm going to do, and here's how I'm going to continue to show up in my integrity, right, as
Yeah.
much as I can. But there is that assessment that happens, and I think it can be really easy when you're not the person who has to have the conversation to be like, well, you absolutely should have the conversation. When you're the person who doesn't have to take the risk, when you're the person who doesn't have to take the heat, it can be really easy sometimes as an outsider to be like, well, of course you should report it. Of course you should do this. And it's just not always that simple. And I think that's part of the complexity of, it is part of the complexity, and it's part of the power dynamics that happen in the workplace, that which is why I say this with love, people who are leading people, it isn't enough to assume you wouldn't do this. You have to investigate and go, when have I? When have I? Or when might I? So
Right.
I can be aware of that trap, and be really thoughtful about that.
Yeah. And it helps to define what retaliation is to you,
Yeah.
right? And are there
Well, and
levels of
and
retaliation
what it
that
might
you're
look like to
comfortable with?
others, and what it looks like to others, because I think if
Yes.
we're defining it by what I mean, I might be like, no, I wasn't retaliating. You are just not, you're a poor performer. So
Right.
we're just not gonna have you on this team.
Well, and that's where it comes being explicit in terms of
Yeah.
like team agreements,
Mhm.
performance, what's expected, what's allowed, what's not allowed, like team norms, basically,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
If you're
Yeah.
being very explicit in all of these, then it becomes easier to hold yourself to a higher standard, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of the, I mean, that's one of the, from a psychological safety perspective, because I know that's being talked about so much more, but I feel like it's not always backed up with, well, here's how you actually build it. But one of the
Right.
ways is exactly what you're saying is let's get really clear on expectations, not just for team members, but for ourselves as leaders.
Yep.
And I think that's a trap too that sometimes senior leaders can fall into is they want they want the explicitness for everyone else, they want the expectations for everyone else. And there's just this assumption they're doing it again instead of the no, what are we doing to hold ourselves to a higher standard? How are we investigating? And I'm using that word really intentionally. How are
Yeah.
we investigating and owning what we're doing or not doing that's getting in the way? And so I love that you're bringing that up because it's just so often that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And we just get into these relationships and these team dynamics and we don't get really clear about well what's actually expected and what's okay and what's not. And boy, I go back to that word of tolerating because I mean, I always say like cultures are what we do, don't do, say, don't say, what we celebrate and what we tolerate.
Yeah.
And
It, it's
there's a
very
lot of
true.
tolerating happening out there.
There is, yeah. I wanted to bring up as an example of something I saw on Twitter this morning. So it was a feed. I don't think there were people I normally follow, but anyways, so it was a situation where they were in a meeting. They went into this meeting predetermined. It was a woman of color, a white man.
Hmm.
And she came up with a really great idea and it was ignored. He waited
I
10 minutes.
saw this.
Did you see this?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
He
Yeah, they
waited, oh
keep
yeah,
talking.
he waited 10 minutes and then introduced the idea. And it was amazing. It was wonderful, fantastic. And so, anyways, the thread basically came down to the fact that they were working together to
Mhm.
highlight the fact that if a woman, especially a person of color,
Mhm.
suggests an idea and it's a good idea, that it's likely going to be ignored. But if a white man introduces it, it's likely going to be recognized as valuable. Turns out he recorded the meeting and uh, they put this in front of management and basically they were told they were in trouble for recording the meeting for
Yeah.
coming to this with intention to demonstrate that this was happening. What were your thoughts about that since you did actually see it?
I know it's really it was fascinating. What I appreciated is the gentleman recognized that he could take more heat and that there would be
Yes.
more backlash towards her being a woman of color. And so he was very explicit in this was my idea. I'm the one who recorded it. I'm the one who did all of this. And even then, right? Like there was still a realization or acknowledgement that the risk was going to be way higher. The retaliation was going to be way higher for her than for him.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
That thread didn't go where I was thinking it was going to go, and it was sort of a lovely turn, and of like, oh, right, somebody was
Yeah.
aware that how normal
I
this is.
I didn't know it was going to go that way as well too. I was surprised because you don't often see, especially a white male, and I could
Mhm.
be inappropriate in saying that, taking
Or a
that
white
level of
or a white
responsibility and
woman.
accountability,
Yeah,
or yeah, yeah, a woman who's willing to risk that,
yeah. I
right?
mean, that's the work
That's the work.
is right. Like we have to be willing. Those of us when we're in a situation where we're part of the dominant culture, that's part of one way we can like when we talk about this idea of retaliating, a lot of times other people see it. They know what's happening. And then, right, you get the messages in your DMs or you get the side conversations of like, wow, I'm really sorry that she said that to you. I'm really sorry that he did that to you. And it's like, well, that's great, but supporting me in the shadows doesn't change it. But I also have had situations where I go, I understand why you didn't speak up. I mean, you saw the heat I took. Like, I get why you didn't.
Yeah.
And again, like if we're in positions of power and authority informally and formally, when I say informally, right? Like if you're a white person, you have power and
Yes.
authority. And if you are, a man, you have even more so. And like, how do we use that and risk it? And knowing that just exactly like he said so beautifully, like it wasn't going to cost him,
Yeah.
like it could potentially cost her, but how valuable. And then here's what I wonder what the leadership team, like what were the conversations? Because this is where you could go, ooh, you held up a mirror to us, you're showing me something I don't like about myself, I don't like that, therefore I'm going to, right, like be irritated with you, be frustrated with you. I'm going to, again, this is where the retaliation happens. Like
Right.
you embarrassed me, so now I'm going to embarrass you. You made me feel powerless, therefore I'm going to make you feel powerless. I'm going to reclaim that.
Yeah.
Or I hope that there's some of them that go,
Yeah.
damn, you're right. We
And
got to work on.
that's where it's like, it would be super interesting to know what this company is actually going to do, because this is what they're tolerating
Yeah.
and this is how they're retaliating.
Yeah.
Precise example,
Yeah. That's
right?
such, I'm so glad you brought that up. And that makes me want to go on that feed and find it now and be like, so what happened?
I
So
know.
what
Well,
were the
maybe we can put
conversations?
that in the show notes and people can comment and follow along. I'll go back and look for it too. So, but
Yeah.
that's a precise example too. But it also comes
Mhm.
down to, I have another story too to tell. We worked with a gentleman and he was very he didn't embrace women,
Mm.
right?
Mhm. Yeah.
But it was funny because there wasn't a lot of proof and there wasn't a lot of people who were willing to talk about it. So my manager actually asked me because I he went on vacation. He went on vacation. This was awesome. He went on vacation, didn't tell anybody he was going on vacation for a month. And there was a $50 million plan that was actually leaving. And
Mm.
so he knew it was going to be, for about one of a better word, a shit show.
Yeah.
And so he gave him my name because
Mhm.
he knew I could handle it, right? Yeah, so that was fun. He got in a lot of trouble because they ended up having to hire like 8 people to do overtime, all this stuff. But anyways, the end result was I had a lot of evidence that he had left them with my name specifically because he knew I was capable. But when he came back, he spent a lot of time downplaying my capabilities because I was female. And
Mm.
so my manager actually asked me to write him up
Mm.
because he treated her the same way.
Mm.
So she knew her own personal experience, what he was like.
Yeah.
Um, and so
What
she
kept her
asked,
from doing that?
hmm?
What kept her from doing that? She
Hmm,
had more authority than you.
best part, right? So
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, I have, I mean, I had known this for a long time because I'd worked with him for 10 years. And so it's like, okay, we now have an opportunity. I will do this for you because she asked me. I was the only person who was willing to back her up. And
Mm.
so when it came to push comes to shove, she's like, I can't do it because you're the only example. She
Mm.
wasn't brave enough. She wasn't courageous enough.
Mm. Mhm.
And she let it go.
Mm.
So that again becomes what you're tolerating.
Mhm.
Right. So
And
the
it's
answer
the
to all of my story was I got a different job.
sure, yeah. No
In case
doubt. I
you're
hope so.
wondering where all these stories,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I
I
hope so.
was like, I'm done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, this is again, I think like what's coming up for me is don't assume humiliation, punishment, retaliation isn't happening.
Yeah.
Just because you're not hearing about it, just because people aren't making formal complaints, just because they aren't, don't assume it's not happening. On some level, maybe assume it is and try to like get, sniff it out. Try to, again, be investigative and courageous and go, what are we doing or not doing that might that people might experience as humiliation, punishment, or retaliation? Like,
I
and
have
let's be
another
really honest with that.
I have another hybrid example too. Um, there were people who were in So we were doing Ask Me Anythings, and it was all held like online. And so people would have the ability to actually submit questions anonymously,
Mm, mhm.
and they didn't like the questions that were coming through.
Sure. Oh, yeah, sure.
They
This
got rid of the
I've
ability
seen
to.
this.
You've seen this before? Yeah. So
No.
they got rid of the ability to ask questions anonymously, and then they're like, "Why is nobody asking us questions?"
Yeah, because
Yeah,
you shut it
wonder.
down. Like, this is I mean, this is and it's not and I say this from, like, somebody who's doing the like, I'm trying to do the work with my own company, right? Um, I'm working with a coach from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, and, she shared with me, she said, "I feel silenced in your spaces sometimes
Yeah,
because you're so agreeable." Like, you're all so nice, you're so agreeable, you're very polite, and I don't always see demonstrated disagreements, I don't see demonstrated pushing back, I don't see and, like, m my intention is never for somebody to feel silenced, like, that boy, that was like a gut punch,
yeah,
and I could say, "Screw you, that's not who we are, I'm done working with you," or whatever, but instead, I'm like, "How is it true?"
yeah. That
And as I examine
curiosity.
it and it's that getting courageously curious, right? Like,
Yes.
how might it be true? And when I think of other stories where either for myself or leaders I've worked with who've been able to like who've received tough feedback. We had somebody on our show recently, Jeff Anderson. He's a leader up in Moose Jaw. And we love him so much.
Mhm.
But we were talking about his leadership journey, and he said, the real defining moment was he was early on in his career, and he had one of a team member, so like a couple levels below, right? And he said, "I got to be honest, Jeff, I don't look forward to coming into work, and you're a big reason for it," which took an incredible amount of courage on the part
Wow.
of the guy. But
Yeah.
imagine, and I always I share that story because I'm always like, imagine how would you respond? How would your leadership respond if they received that? They'd be like, "Screw you, buddy," or right? But he went and thought, "How might it be true?" And his willingness for that intellectual humility, his willingness to go, "Huh," is what set him on the path to being such a dedicated people first leader. And he's one of the best kind of without, I mean, like not just anecdotally, but like data and research we've done, right, with his team, he scores higher than like it's not even comparable to other leaders and in the safety people feel not and they're not perfect, right? Like they've got things to work on and it's always a work in progress and calibrating and things shift and change and all of that. But they're able to tackle it, right? In part because he's willing to go, what am I doing to contribute to this low trust? What am I doing to contribute? And so if there's a question that I would have people reflect on is when you get really tough feedback, just ask yourself, how might it be true?
Yep.
And, you know, and um and be willing to consider that and then be willing to act on that.
Yep.
It's not easy. I mean, God, it's not easy. Like that
No.
was not easy when I got that. I mean, that's just one of many like moments of receiving really tough feedback on this journey. But yeah.
So there was one time I actually had my manager approach me, and it wasn't actually even something that she said. It was the way that she walked up to me. And I remember looking at her like, she's afraid of me,
Mm, mm, mm,
because she had to tell me something that she knew I wasn't going to like.
mm,
And she knew
mm.
that I would be armed with data and backup and documentation.
Yeah.
So it wasn't even something that she approached me with, but it was just the way her manner. And so
Yeah.
that was important feedback for me to look at, because it's like I liked her. I didn't have a problem with working with her. I mean, we didn't always get along, but I didn't want her to be afraid of me,
Yeah.
right? But it was funny because it's like I stepped back because I'm like, you've actually given me something useful to work with. It's like, what am I doing that actually is intimidating to you? And what I realized was she was operating from a place where she felt powerless
Yeah.
because she felt caught. She was being
Mm,
asked to implement policies and procedures and provide feedback that she did not necessarily believe in
Hmm.
and she knew wasn't right.
Mm.
And she
Mhm.
knew I would not drop it.
Sure.
And
Mhm.
she was afraid where it was going to go. And she was afraid for me, actually,
Sure.
because
And I
she could
imagine
only
also
protect me so far.
yeah, and potentially being the one who like might open up the what like firing squad, so to speak. Like,
Right.
that's but what I love about that story though is that moment of because here's what I hear happen in those moments. And again, like I get to be I the thing that I love, and I think you're probably similar. Like in our world, we get this amazing front row view to humanity. We get
Yeah.
this amazing front row view to humans and relationships and leadership and dynamics. Is that most people, what I've heard is like, oh, you don't need to be. I'm just Sarah. Like you don't need to be intimidated by me. Like what? Who am I? I mean, I'm just right. It's like, and even that action, like I'm just whatever. Instead of again interrogating, reflecting, investigating, going, there's something I'm doing that
Yeah.
may be contributing to it. And I think that the other thing that we have to understand, this was a lesson I learned in a different way, different avenue, is, and there might be something I'm not doing that's contributing to it, right? It's like,
Yeah.
it may not be that you are doing anything that is reinforcing the idea that you're intimidating, because maybe it's just you'd had previous experiences with other leaders or other people or other personalities like you or whatever the case is. But it could be that there's things we're not doing, right? I'm not asking for feedback regularly. I'm not asking and responding to tough feedback. I'm not,
Yeah.
insert whatever.
Right.
But I love that you were willing to reflect and go, huh, how do I change that? Because I mean, that's definitely the mode. I go into a similar mode when I can tell like my colleagues are hesitant to maybe share something, and it's like, what do I need to do differently to make it easier for you to share that
Right.
sooner?
And then it became actually like, if I step back and I hold back on my normal reaction, what I really want to do, is there a way that we can actually approach it where we present as a united team and she
Mm,
feels supported
yeah.
and I can actually get further traction because she's going to be the one to present it, not me.
Mm,
So
mm,
how do you strategically reframe and go, huh, this is interesting. What is it we need to actually fix so that we both present with more power?
yeah. 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 I love
And
that.
that's where it's like it can be really interesting, um, to rejig the dynamics.
Mm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, it got me so far. But as I said, then I left.
Sure.
But we are way over time, and
We sure
we know
are.
from example that we can continue talking forever and ever. But was there anything that you wanted to bring up that we didn't cover?
No. I
No?
mean, like, for people who are interested, would invite you to check out the book, Don't Feed the Elephants, wherever books are sold. Leave us thoughts on what you think. It's my love letter to my fellow avoiders of conflict
Yeah,
and
and
how
she
we
loves
can
pictures
step
of
out of that.
elephants. She has like so many stuffed animals and pictures
We
and
don't need to keep
tchotchkes.
encouraging people to sending me stuff, but
It's okay. If I was
if
going to adapt, I would actually adopt a hippo. So the highest
sure. Mm.
person's opinion, that
Oh,
that
right, right,
hippo
right, right, right,
concept.
right. That
Yes,
came
you
up
can
in
have
our
the
our
elephants. I want the hippos.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
Uh,
just thank you for having me, Nola. I
oh
appreciate
yeah,
it.
no problem. It's important to talk about the stuff that people are not brave enough to talk about. So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
hope that if you've listened to this, and we've helped you, then that's really what we were going for. So,
Mhm.
anyways, the power of the reframe is always what we want to leave you with. So, anyways, thanks, Sarah, and
Thank you.
I'll just hit stop.